On a warm August afternoon in the quiet town of Greenville, Illinois, something unthinkable happened. A man, respected, admired, and known for his dedication to justice, was suddenly gone, shot down in cold blood right outside his own law office. His name was Thomas Meyer, and to this day, people still ask, why? Who could have wanted him dead? What secrets lay hidden in the life of this small-town attorney? And could justice ever truly balance the scales after such a loss? As a woman, I can't help but imagine the fear, the heartbreak that must have washed over his family that day. A normal afternoon turned into a tragedy they could never escape. This is the story of Thomas Meyer, and tonight we're going to step back in time and uncover what really happened. Thomas Meyer was 67 years old in the summer of 1996. By all accounts, he wasn't just another attorney, he was a fixture in Greenville. He was respected, professional, and deeply woven into the fabric of this small Midwestern community. If you've ever lived in a small town, you know what that means. People know each other. They greet each other on the street. They share coffee, stories, and memories. Thomas wasn't just a lawyer. He was a neighbor, a friend, someone people trusted to help them through life's most difficult challenges. But on August 12, 1996, everything changed. At approximately 1:45 p.m., outside Meyer's law firm in downtown Greenville, shots rang out. The echoes shattered the stillness of the afternoon. Witnesses reported confusion. People ran, ducking for safety. And then, silence. Thomas Meyer was found lying in the alley behind his office. He had been shot multiple times. His life was over in an instant. For Greenville, this wasn't just shocking, it was surreal. Murders like this didn't happen here. Not in this quiet, close-knit town. And I can't help but think of how his colleagues must have felt, stepping out into that alley and seeing him there. Someone they had spoken to just hours earlier, gone forever. Police quickly secured the area. The major case squad of Greater St. Louis was called in, a task force of detectives brought together whenever a case is too big for local police to handle alone. And that told the community something important. This wasn't just a crime. This was serious. As detectives began piecing together what had happened, the biggest question on everyone's mind was simple. Who would want Thomas Meyer dead? At first glance, he didn't fit the profile of someone with enemies. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't mixed up in shady business. He was a small-town attorney, known for family law, divorces, custody cases, wills. But if you've ever seen how bitter divorces can become, you know the truth. Behind the walls of courtrooms, emotions run high. Anger turns into hatred, and sometimes people make choices that can never be undone. Within hours, investigators had a lead. A name kept coming up: Kelly Lee McGinnis. McGinnis was 39 years old. He wasn't just some stranger passing through town. He had a connection, a painful personal one. You see, Thomas Meyer had been the divorce lawyer representing McGinnis's ex-wife, and to McGinnis, that made Meyer the enemy. As a woman, it's heartbreaking to see how often anger in broken relationships gets redirected, not just at the ex-spouse, but at anyone standing beside them. And in this case, that fury was aimed at Thomas Meyer. Police began digging deeper. They learned that McGinnis had a history of volatile behavior. Friends described him as someone who could be charming at times, but beneath the surface, his temper was explosive. The divorce had left him feeling bitter, humiliated, and to him, Meyer represented everything he had lost. Investigators quickly obtained a warrant, and the evidence they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Witnesses reported seeing McGinnis near Meyer's office. Some claimed he had made threats in the past, and when detectives confronted him, his story didn't add up. Within days, authorities filed first-degree murder charges against him. He was arrested and held without bond. For Thomas Meyer's family, the news must have been a strange mixture of emotions. On one hand, there was relief. The man suspected of taking their loved one's life was behind bars. But on the other, it didn't bring Thomas back. And for Greenville, the shock deepened. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. But as detectives soon learned, a suspect in custody doesn't mean a case is solved. The question now was, could prosecutors prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Kelly Lee McGinnis had pulled the trigger? And what if there was more to the story than anyone realized? When the major case squad of Greater St. Louis takes on an investigation, it means business. This task force isn't just one or two detectives. It's an entire team of specialists, pulled from across the region, each with experience in the most serious crimes. And in August of 1996, their mission was clear: unravel the murder of Thomas Meyer. Picture the scene that day. Yellow tape stretched across the alley, the afternoon sun beating down on officers as they searched for every possible clue. The small town of Greenville was buzzing with whispers, neighbors peeking from their windows, stunned that such violence had found its way here. Forensic technicians began their work. They combed the alley for bullet casings, blood evidence, and footprints. They photographed the scene from every angle, carefully marking each piece of evidence. Every shell casing, every trace of residue could tell part of the story. But solving a case isn't just about science, it's also about people. Detectives began interviewing everyone who might have seen or heard something unusual. Office workers nearby, shop owners on the same street, even people who had simply been walking downtown that afternoon. And time after time, a name resurfaced: Kelly Lee McGinnis. McGinnis wasn't just suspected because of his bitter divorce. Witnesses reported troubling behavior. Some claimed he had openly voiced anger toward Thomas Meyer, blaming him for his marriage falling apart. Others said McGinnis had been spotted near Meyer's office in the days leading up to the shooting, as if he had been watching, waiting. It's chilling to imagine Thomas Meyer going about his work, meeting clients, drafting papers, answering phone calls, never realizing someone might have been shadowing him, planning the unthinkable. The evidence began to form a web. Gunshot residue was tested, timelines were cross-checked, alibis or the lack of them were scrutinized. And soon, investigators believed they had enough to connect McGinnis directly to the crime. As a woman, I can't help but think of how unfair it is. Thomas Meyer wasn't the one who ended that marriage. He wasn't the one making decisions about love, loyalty, or loss. He was simply doing his job, and yet he became the target of someone else's rage. The major case squad pressed forward. They worked long nights, gathering testimony, reviewing forensic results, building a case piece by piece, and within days, prosecutors announced that McGinnis would face trial for first-degree murder. But even with an arrest, questions still lingered. Was the evidence truly strong enough? Could a jury be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt? And most importantly, what exactly had unfolded in those final moments behind Thomas Meyer's office? An arrest is only the beginning. For justice to truly be served, the prosecution had to convince a jury that Kelly Lee McGinnis was the man who pulled the trigger on August 12, 1996. And in the world of criminal trials, nothing is guaranteed. The courtroom in Greenville became the stage for one of the most shocking legal battles the community had ever seen. On one side stood the prosecutors, armed with forensic evidence, eyewitness accounts, and a clear motive: a bitter ex-husband, consumed by rage, lashing out at the attorney who represented his former wife. On the other side sat Kelly Lee McGinnis and his defense team, determined to cast doubt on every shred of evidence. As a woman, I've often noticed how trials don't just seek truth, they also perform for the jury. Words, emotions, and appearances carry as much weight as cold, hard facts. And in a case like this, where heartbreak and anger collided, emotions ran high. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. Motive: McGinnis's hatred for Meyer, fueled by the divorce. Opportunity: his presence near Meyer's office that day. Evidence: witness testimony, forensic testing, and patterns of behavior. They painted McGinnis as a man driven by obsession, unable to accept his marriage's end, and willing to take his rage out on the person he blamed most. The defense, however, pushed back hard. They argued there was no direct evidence linking McGinnis to the trigger, no murder weapon recovered in his possession, no eyewitness who could definitively say they saw him pull the gun. And in criminal court, that tiny sliver of doubt can mean the difference between life in prison and walking free. Witnesses were cross-examined, their memories tested, forensic experts were questioned, their conclusions challenged. The defense worked to blur the lines, to suggest that maybe investigators had jumped too quickly to McGinnis. Maybe someone else had a grudge against Thomas Meyer. It's a tactic that has worked in countless trials before. Create just enough uncertainty, and a jury may hesitate to convict. I can imagine the toll this must have taken on Meyer's family, sitting there day after day hearing every detail of his final moments turned into arguments and counter-arguments. For them, this wasn't theory, this wasn't strategy, this was their loss. The trials stretched on, each side clashing over the same central question: was Kelly Lee McGinnis truly guilty of first-degree murder, or had the state failed to meet its heavy burden of proof? The answer would soon come, but whatever the jury decided, one truth remained undeniable: Greenville would never be the same again. No matter the verdict, no matter the outcome of a trial, one truth remains: a life was lost. And for Greenville, the murder of Thomas Meyer left scars that time could never completely heal. The day the verdict was read, the courthouse was heavy with silence. Families of both the victim and the accused sat only feet apart, separated by nothing more than wooden benches and an ocean of grief. On one side, Meyer's loved ones, still struggling to understand why their father, their friend, their colleague had been taken from them in such a brutal way. On the other side, the McGinnis family, grappling with the shame and disbelief of seeing someone they loved accused of the unthinkable. As a woman, I can't help but imagine the mothers in that room, both of them aching in different ways. One for a son who was gone, the other for a son accused of the unthinkable. For Greenville, the case shattered illusions of safety. This was a town where people didn't lock their doors, where crime was something you read about in the newspaper from faraway cities, not something that arrived at your doorstep. But Thomas Meyer's death changed that. Suddenly, the community saw how fragile peace could be. At his funeral, the church overflowed with people, friends, clients, and neighbors came together to mourn. Many spoke of his kindness, his dedication to justice, and his belief in doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. One colleague described him as the voice people turned to when they were lost. Another said he carried the weight of people's problems so they didn't have to. And in that moment, everyone realized Greenville hadn't just lost a lawyer, they had lost a cornerstone of their community. The impact rippled far beyond his office walls. Clients struggled, wondering who would now take their cases. Colleagues felt an emptiness at the firm, walking past his office, seeing his chair still in place. Family faced birthdays, holidays, and milestones without him. A quiet chair at the dinner table, an empty voice in conversations. As women, as caregivers, we often think of the silent grief, the way a wife or daughter might fold away his shirts, the way they'd pause at a photo frame, the way they'd keep waiting for footsteps that would never come. That's the part of tragedy the courtroom never sees. For Greenville, life went on, but not as it had before. The murder of Thomas Meyer became a reminder that even in the safest places, violence can strike, that behind courtroom doors, emotions can grow into storms too big to contain. And for many, it raised questions far deeper than guilt or innocence. Questions about anger, about justice, about how easily one man's choices can destroy so many lives. Even when a trial ends, even when a verdict is read, there are always shadows that linger. For the murder of Thomas Meyer, those shadows still hang heavy. Because while the state built its case against Kelly Lee McGinnis, some people in Greenville whispered questions that never went away. The first question, was the evidence truly enough? Yes, McGinnis had motive. Yes, he had anger and bitterness from his divorce. And yes, witnesses placed him near Meyer's office. But there was no smoking gun. No eyewitness who said, "I saw him pull the trigger." No recovered weapon directly tying him to the murder. And in criminal justice, that missing piece leaves room for doubt. The second question, could someone else have been responsible? As an attorney, Thomas Meyer had handled dozens, maybe hundreds of sensitive cases. Family disputes, custody battles, financial disagreements. Any one of those could have left a person bitter enough to lash out. In small towns, grudges run deep. And while McGinnis seemed like the obvious suspect, some wondered if the real story was more complicated. The third question, was justice truly served? For Meyer's family, a guilty verdict could never bring back the man they loved. For McGinnis's family, a conviction meant watching their son, brother, or father spend his life behind bars. In the end, justice in cases like this often feels incomplete, because no sentence, no courtroom outcome can erase the pain of what happened that day in 1996. As a woman, I can't help but think about the ripple effect. Thomas's wife, if she was alive at the time, suddenly alone. His children robbed of a father's wisdom. His clients losing not just a lawyer but someone who stood with them through their darkest hours. And even the McGinnis family, mothers, sisters, daughters, left to wrestle with the shame of a relative tied to such a crime. In tragedies like this, it is so often women who hold the broken pieces together, quietly in the background. Finally, the last question, why? Why did a disagreement born in divorce papers and courtrooms spiral into bloodshed in a quiet Illinois alley? Was it hatred? Was it desperation? Or was it simply a man who could not accept the end of something he once held dear? Some questions will never have clean answers, and perhaps that is why Thomas Meyer's story still lingers in the minds of many. Because it wasn't just about law or evidence or trials. It was about human emotion, love, anger, pride, and the terrible destruction they can cause. And so decades later, we are left with both resolution and mystery. The case closed, but the echoes of doubt still remain. The murder of Thomas Meyer was more than just a crime in a courtroom file. It was a reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly ordinary days can twist into tragedy. For Greenville, it was a wake-up call.
For Meyer's family, it was heartbreak beyond words. And for all of us who look back, it is a story about the cost of anger and the devastating ways it can spiral out of control. As a woman, I think often about the quiet survivors of these crimes. The wives who hold back tears while trying to stay strong. The daughters who lose their protectors. The sisters who light candles year after year. They carry grief in silence, long after headlines fade. And in Thomas Meyer's story, that silent grief became part of Greenville's history. His death teaches us something important. Justice isn't only about trials and verdicts. It's about remembering the lives behind the headlines, honoring their legacies, and asking ourselves how to prevent tragedies like this from happening again. Because when anger is left unchecked,